For 20 years, GMOs have spread across the planet. Genetically modified organisms. They're predominantly plants, their genetic material transformed by scientists primarily to increase their yield. Soy, corn, cotton, canola. GMOs are now said to cover over 10% of the world's farmland. But they're also the object of fierce opposition.
We head north and we stick together. We're here to chop down crops and assert the rights of all citizens to refuse GMOs.
In Europe, the vast majority of the public is opposed to genetically modified crops. All over the world, people are concerned about the dangers of GMOs, not only for public health, but for the environment and for farmers as well. They criticize the influence of the seed and pesticide giants like the American company Monsanto.
Monsanto, dégage! Le peuple rat à veau! Le business, dégage! Le peuple rat à veau!
Imminent disaster for some, major breakthrough for others. The global controversy between those who are for or against GMOs has made for a heated and sometimes obscure debate, polluted by false arguments that have no real basis in science. How do we separate truth from false? What are the facts about GMOs?
Small piece of dry ice. And let's see.
The United States is where the first GMO crops were grown. Bt crops, which belong to one of the two major categories of GMOs, were designed to resist harmful pests like the corn borer and rootworm.
Ah, here's one. The rootworm beetle is often referred to as the billion-dollar bug. That is a low estimate of the cost. And the $1 billion refers to the losses caused by the insects and the money spent to try to protect corn from rootworm beetles. When we have a lot of beetles, they can lay so many eggs in there that an unprotected cornfield would be practically destroyed. The larvae feed on corn roots in order to survive. Let's see if there's any larvae in here. We're going to bring it out and put it on the tray. One of the things you can notice about this root is all these fine root hairs, all this fine tissue here. If there were a lot of rootworm larvae, they would have chewed away all this fine root tissue. Roots that are not protected from rootworm beetles and that are fed on heavily will look like this. This one was not protected either by a soil insecticide or any sort of Bt corn. The GMO plants were constructed by inserting a gene from the soil organism Bacillus thuringiensis.
Bacillus thuringiensis, or Bt, is a bacteria that secretes several insecticidal proteins. To create a Bt plant, scientists perform transgenesis. This involves extracting a gene from the Bt bacteria, then inserting the DNA fragment into the plant's embryonic cells. This transgene, derived from another organism, produces a toxin that will be ingested by insects if they eat the plant.
It opens pores in the insect's midgut, in its intestinal system, and the larvae would die. It's targeting receptors that are only present in the insects. We don't have these receptors. And one of the great advantages of Bt corn is that it only kills the target insect. Unlike When we spray a field with insecticide to try to kill adults, we kill all the insects that are in the field. It has an added advantage in that the growers are using less pesticide, but BT corn costs more than regular corn. However, these BT corn varieties are producing much greater yields than we used to expect. And so the profitability is there.
The other main category of transgenic plants is called HT, herbicide tolerant. Over 80% of GMOs grown today in the world contain this trait, especially soy. Once the plant has been injected with a microbial gene, it is able to survive a broad-spectrum herbicide like glyphosate, the active ingredient in Monsanto's notorious Roundup. This means that when farmers spray Roundup onto their fields, all the weeds will in principle be destroyed, but not the transgenic crops, which tolerate Roundup and are called Roundup Ready.
1996 was the first year. When we first came up with the Roundup Ready soybeans, we were ecstatic because I think there wasn't a farmer in the country that said, man, if I could just have a soybean that I could spray Roundup on and it would kill everything except the soybeans, and then all of a sudden there it was. And it made controlling the weeds so easy. So it was almost a total and complete adaptation to the GM crops. Never in the history of the U.S. in agriculture had any technology ever been adapted so fast and so completely. There was not a yield boost. It was just easier. And you could farm more acres, so you didn't have to make as much per acre. You could just farm more acres and make fewer dollars per acre. So it pushed that revolution of, you know, you got to get bigger, you got to get bigger, you got to get bigger, you got to farm more acres. This is our farm on this side. This is about 3,000 acres, or is not a huge farm. The next farm, the guys that farm the next farm to us, farm 8,000 acres. That's why you see, we'll drive for miles and you see no houses anymore. And there used to be 6 houses with people when I was younger, and now they're not. I mean, the houses are tore down. This house, it's vacant, so you'll notice not a lot of traffic.
Today in the United States, GMOs represent around 90% of soy, corn, and cotton agriculture. In Argentina, it's nearly 100%. Argentinian farmers have overwhelmingly adopted GMO technology. This is particularly true for GM soy, grown and harvested in vast plantations.
Soy had a boom, first because compared to other crops, it's easier to handle in terms of applying herbicides, fungicides, etc. Next, because we got good prices on the international market, so it was a profitable crop to grow. We devoted many fields to soy production. The size of these fields is impressive, but that's the kind of acreage we're looking for in our production sector. Huge surfaces that will allow us to dilute costs.
Since the introduction of GMOs in 1996, the land area devoted to soy has tripled in Argentina, reaching a total of nearly 20 million hectares today. The intensive monoculture of soy has pushed back other crops, along with the forests. The legendary landscape of the Pampas, dotted with cows roaming free, has given way to feedlots. For supporters, GMOs are an essential tool for meeting the food needs of a rapidly growing global population, which is set to increase from 7 to 9 billion in 2050. It's the classic argument of GMO companies like Monsanto, the global leader, which makes $15 billion in turnover and employs 20,000 people in around 60 countries.
This type of crop allows us to obtain a better yield per unit area. This is how we're going to feed the world of tomorrow. The new technologies we're currently rolling out increase average yield by 7 to 10% for soy. Extrapolated to the entire country, that's considerable. This year, we've seen soy yields of 8,000 kilograms per hectare. It's huge. And what really helped Argentina pull itself out of the crisis was agricultural production. In fact, we're one of the major exporters, not just of soybeans, but also of oil and flour. It's the country's biggest source of foreign exchange.
Many countries, shown in orange on the map, import GMOs, including Europe for livestock feed. And 28 countries, shown in green, grow GMOs. But of the 180 million hectares farmed in 2014, 85% are concentrated on the American continent, and 40% in the United States, the leading producers of GMOs on the planet. Transgenic crops have now become the norm on American farms. And in laboratories, new plants are being tested. Like potatoes, genetically modified to resist diseases such as late blight or the potato virus Y.
We're here in the tissue culture lab where my postdoc here, Swati, is doing genetic engineering of the potato. So it's very simple. Is that what we do is we take these plants and we cut them into pieces, the leaves and the stems, and then those can be used for the gene transfer process or the transformation process. But in the other part of the lab, we're growing the bacteria that has the gene inserted into the plasmid of the bacteria. And so we create a wound surface on both sides of the leaf so that the bacteria can infect that cell, and in the infection process, we'll actually insert a small segment of DNA that we placed in the bacteria. And so if the transformation was successful, we would expect to see some shoots regenerating. And so if we're able to put resistance genes into the potato, for example, the late blight disease, we can significantly reduce the amount of fungicides that are applied to the potato. And so having plants that are innately resistant is better for the environment. We know that there's a lot of people that have, concerns about the technology, the safety of the crop. But we live in a world where we can never ensure complete safety. And so we really need to move past that and make this technology acceptable.
Concerns about the potential dangers of biotechnology go back a long way. They surfaced as early as the first GMOs, which were not of plants, but of bacteria. In 1972, American biochemist Paul Berg of Stanford University made the first attempt at transgenesis by recombining DNA molecules in the Escherichia coli bacteria genome. In response to concern over new techniques of the manipulation of living material called genetic engineering, Berg organized a conference in Asilomar, California in 1975, which was attended by 100 biologists from around the world.
Many scientists, including those who were creating GMOs, were very concerned. They were very concerned about what would happen if humans came in touch with these bacteria, but also if these bacteria were released into the environment. So they said, we take responsibility for what's happening in our labs, and we leave it to the future for someone else to take responsibility for environmental releases. But there has never been an Asilomar conference for environmental releases. There was never an evaluation of what could happen.
The controversy over GMOs really began in the 90s, when genetically modified crops suddenly began to arrive in France from the United States. And Greenpeace launched a huge campaign. An article in the national paper, Liberation, really set things off. It was called Mad Soy Alert. A boat with a cargo of genetically modified soy landed in Europe. On the photo, you see the guys from Greenpeace wearing white lab coats and the X from X-Files, which was the series everyone was watching back then, and had a fondness for conspiracy theories. Why mad soy? Because we were right in the middle of the mad cow disease. Mad cow showed us that the agricultural system was taking reckless risks. People had kind of lost faith that institutions would protect them in terms of what they ate and how their health was handled. And right then, GMOs arrive. I think that if there hadn't been that conjunction, there probably wouldn't have been such an intense controversy.
As the debate heats up in Europe, doubts are beginning to be voiced in the United States, right in the heart of GMO land. Because the insects that were supposed to be eliminated by Bt crops aren't behaving exactly as planned. For the past few years, they've started to become resistant to the toxin produced by the plant.
Western corn rootworm resistance to Bt corn is documented now from several states. Began in Iowa in 2011. It's been documented in this field 2 years ago. I think the main reason that the resistance evolved has to do with the way that the product was used. It was such a wonderful product that growers used it year after year after year, and so we overused Bt and we created a population that evolved resistance. And at the time Bt hybrids were commercialized, the expectation was that we could manage these insects without putting tremendous amounts of broad spectrum insecticides into the environment. What's ironic now is that as we face rootworm beetles that are resistant to Bt, we're now putting soil insecticide in some cases on Bt corn hybrids, which is a terrible strategy.
Today, it's not just the farmers of Bt crops who are worried. It's also the farmers of HT crops, crops that can tolerate herbicides like glyphosate, Monsanto's Roundup. Because weeds are also developing a resistance, not to the transgenic plant in this case, but to the herbicide associated with it.
There's another one.
These super weeds, as they're called, are now prevalent on American farms, even more than super pests.
You can see the lighter green are what we would call the water hemp, which we have a much more significant problem in this field with that. And it's not just us, it's everywhere. You can see where the spray has been sprayed on it when it was younger, and the green that's coming back. And on the mare's tail, you can see how it affected the plant, but it didn't kill it. And it certainly, we call that, we just made it mad. And each year it only gets worse. So Mother Nature will adapt to what's trying to eliminate her, I guess.
We call it Darwinism, and that is the idea that if you push a population with selection in one direction, there will be changes to adapt to that pressure and survive in it. The way it works is that you kill many of the descendants, except the ones that will survive the given pressure, selective pressure, and then those will have more descendants in the future generation and the next generation. Can we say that the GMO technology has increased the phenomenon of herbicide resistance? I think the answer is yes. The introduction of the resistance to one herbicide made it possible to apply much more herbicide any time of the year, so the window of selection of the weeds became much wider through the year and over many years. This selection was kept. So the specialization in one herbicide became a very important thing.
In the late 90s, when Roundup Ready soy was offered, the rate of application of glyphosate per acre was 8 ounces. Today, people...
8 ounces per acre.
Per acre, which is a small amount.
Yeah.
And today, it could very easily be quadruple, asking people to put on quadruple to hope that they can kill these resistant weeds. So, you know, and then the other way we fight it, if you're going to fight it with technology, is certainly the industry's done pretty well on it, because they say you don't just use one mode of action to kill this now. You need 2 or 3 modes of action out there on that soil to kill this plant now. Because if one doesn't do it, you need to get them with another.
Meaning atrazine, 2,4-D.
Right. It could be atrazine, it could be 2,4-D, it could be other modes of action. And it's not really a problem for them.
No, it's a business opportunity.
It's sales opportunity,
yeah,
exactly.
Of course.
So you sell more chemicals, so you get farmers to put more on, and so then...
They'll never say, sorry, we were wrong, we're going to move out, and good luck, guys.
Yeah.
You know, for a long time, for about 50 years, the industry was moving forwards, always coming up with a new chemical that was a little bit better, less toxic in the environment, more selective, and all that. But they stopped worrying about that. And now what they're doing is going back to the chemicals from the 40s and 50s that we know are really bad.
Contrary to initial promises, the use of herbicides has not decreased with GMOs. Quite the opposite. In Argentina, where herbicides are sprayed onto fields partly by plane, sometimes very close to people's homes, this raises serious public health concerns. According to official statistics, farmland has increased here by 50% in the last 20 years. The volume of phytosanitary products sold, however, has increased by 858%. Since 2010, a professor of medicine has been coordinating a vast epidemiological study in the major GMO farming provinces. The study is conducted by students in their final year.
As of today, our study of epidemiological data involves 21 communities in the provinces of Santa Fe, Entre Rios, Cordoba, and Buenos Aires. In total, there are about between 115 and 120,000 people covered by our study. And we're getting a set of statistics that we find worrying. The average rate of new cancer cases is 386.2 per 100,000 local residents. That's 1.8 times the national rate for cancer cases. We've also noted causes of mortality. And we can see that in most of these communities, cancer has become the main cause of death, even though in our country, the leading causes of death are road accidents and cardiovascular illness. We've also found more cases of birth defects, of children with a disease called cyanomelia. It's a syndrome caused by the defective expression of the COX and COX2 genes, which prevents the proper development of the lower limbs. And when you study the timeline, that is, the date of conception of the mothers of these children, and the stages of gestation, it appears that the first 3 months of the embryo's development coincide with the peak of agrotoxin use in the preparation of fields for GMO crop farming.
In neonatology, which is my area of expertise, there are periods of the year when the intensive care unit is completely full. 90 to 100% of the patients are children with birth defects. This did not used to be the case in Argentina. Women have spontaneous abortions more frequently during the fumigation periods. This rate is 3 times higher than average. It's very clear that this problem appeared and developed with the arrival of genetically modified soy and its agrochemical package. Argentina has between 12 and 14 million people who are fumigated, who live in areas exposed to agrochemical products. That equals 1/4 of the population. There's a fleet of 1,100 planes that represent the Air Force of soy. Aerial fumigation contaminates the water and the air. We found that when it rains and we collect rainwater, it contains a high concentration of glyphosate. We demand that these fumigations be outlawed. For us, it's a criminal practice.
In 2012, a pilot and a GM soy producer were convicted of contaminating a neighborhood of Cordoba, the second largest city in Argentina. The verdict? A 3-year suspended prison sentence. It was a first in Latin America and was due to the determination of local mothers, in particular Sofia Gatica, who received the Goldman Environmental Prize for her work.
It all began in 2001 in the Ituzaingó Anexo neighborhood. I began investigating in the neighborhood because my daughter died of a kidney malformation, and one of my sons couldn't walk after the fumigations. I went from house to house, and I realized that in my street, 6 mothers had lost their babies at birth. Others had leukemia, and nearly everyone I surveyed had cancer. So we decided to put pressure on the government and get some answers. The neighborhood was declared uninhabitable in 2005. The main problem Argentina is facing isn't agrochemicals. It's genetically modified organisms, transgenic crops, because they come with glyphosate and all the agrotoxins.
It's pesticides that kill, not GMOs themselves. But since the appearance of resistant transgenic crops, the use of pesticides has become even more intense and extended throughout the year. In September 2013, despite death threats and several assaults, Sofia Gatica joined a number of residents of Malvinas, a small town near Cordoba, in blocking the construction of a huge Monsanto factory, announced as its biggest factory for GM seeds in Latin America.
Monsanto se tiene que ir de Malvinas a Argentina, de Argentina y de América Latina. Por eso, compañeros, pedimos que nos acompañen a esta lucha, que es una lucha de todos los argentinos. Te lo digo, te lo canto. ¡Fuera Monsanto!
Te lo digo, te lo canto, fuera Monsanto. Te lo digo, te lo canto, fuera Monsanto. Te lo digo, te lo canto, fuera Monsanto. Sofía, veo madre con ovario resistiendo en la vida. Me sumo con mi letra disparando con mi rima. No puedo bancarme que en América Latina me siga el glifosato, dale. Te lo digo, te lo canto.
We've heard that there are certain concerns about the risk. In truth, the risk is non-existent. All the agencies of the countries where the product has been approved have confirmed that these approvals are legitimate and have done tests that conclude that the risk is practically nil. It's very difficult to find studies on glyphosate that show any kind of toxicity or of carcinogenicity.
And yet, that's precisely what appeared on March 20th, 2015, when the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the specialized cancer agency of the WHO, published a scientific evaluation of 5 pesticides, including glyphosate, the world's top-selling herbicide. The summary was printed in the respected journal The Lancet Oncology. A monograph presenting all of the scientific studies that were reviewed will soon be published.
The evaluation process takes about a year. We assembled 17 experts from 11 countries, and approximately 400 studies will be cited in the final monograph. We have 4 different levels of classification. Group 1 are things like cigarette smoke, asbestos, where we're fairly sure the human evidence is knowing that these are causing cancer. Group 2A is one step down from there. This is strictly a very narrow question of, does the agent cause cancer? And in this case, our working group concluded glyphosate is likely to cause cancer in humans.
We don't know which studies they used because the International Agency for Research on Cancer's monograph hasn't been published yet. Other agencies, like Germany's Federal Institute for Risk Assessment, which reviewed more than 55 studies over 5 years, concluded on the contrary that there is no link between glyphosate and cancer.
The study by the German Institute is a separate evaluation, and it's done according to a different procedure than ours. There are several differences. For instance, as I mentioned, our working groups are experts who are clearly independent. We would not have somebody who was an employee of a company who was manufacturing a substance be part of a scientific evaluation. They can come to the scientific evaluation as an observer, but they don't have a voting role. They aren't drafting things for our working group to consider. They have a hands-off role, and that's not exactly the procedure that the German government, for instance, follows. It definitely had a big impact. I think it was unusual in this case because it was one particular company that really was making a lot of media stories and so forth, and contacting us and so forth.
Do you mean there is some pressure?
There can be pressure to make change, pardon me, but excuse me. But we will not be making any changes due to pressure.
It's a plane coming, about to spray us.
The increased use of pesticides, which is linked to the resistance phenomenon, raises serious public health concerns. But there's another phenomenon of equal concern, which targets biodiversity, the risk of contaminating traditional crops that are grown near GMOs, a risk long denied by GMO companies until scientists revealed exactly that in Mexico.
I come from Mexico. I was raised there, and I've worked there for many years in collaboration with some indigenous communities in southern Mexico. And we found, almost by accident, not really expecting it, that there was positive GMO DNA within the corn plants of the Oaxaca people. There had been cross-contamination. There has been what's called inbreeding or introgression of the GMO DNA from the GMOs into local plants. And our results have been published in Nature magazine. So it became immediately a big source of controversy and a headache for the industry. Monsanto was saying that a distance of 1.5 meters was enough to prevent cross-pollination between a plant of corn here and a plant of corn here. And that, I think, to anybody was just not believable. So up here, you have the tassel where the male flowers are produced. And this pollen moves by wind, gets attached to a silk. So one single pollen grain comes into a single silk and then starts traveling down until it finds the ovary of the female flower and fertilizes it. And so each one of these kernels is really carrying the genetic material from both the father, the male flower, and the mother. Monsanto had argued at the beginning that they had control. And what our paper did was to show simply that they didn't. That you cannot really control something that moves through the air. And the whole situation became very, very complicated for me because immediately we started seeing a discreditation campaign. I was very close to losing my job. I had to fight for about 8 years because there were many people telling my university that I should be kicked out for doing this work. And I was treated, gangster style sometimes, that they threaten you and they tell you about your children and they know where they go to school, threats like that. Fortunately, our results have been confirmed by other researchers many times over.
In the case of corn, 95% of the time, corn pollen has dissemination distances of under 100 meters. But there's still 5% that goes into the atmosphere, and that pollen, which is viable, can pollinate non-GMO corn 2 to 3 kilometers away. Pollen, in fact, rises up into the air. Temperatures are cool, there's humidity, and so the pollen remains viable and is able to go to pollinize corn several kilometers away.
The phenomenon of contamination presents a major risk for the diversity of genetic resources, particularly for a country like Mexico, the land of the origin and diversification of corn. In September 2013, after several years of legal battles, a Mexico City district court banned the import and cultivation of genetically modified corn in the country. But Monsanto appealed several times, and in the end, the ban was lifted in 2015. If contamination is a concern, it's also, and maybe especially, because GMOs aren't regular plants. Seeds are patented, protected by intellectual property rights. This forces farmers to purchase them every year, even though until now they could select and plant seeds from the previous year, which cost them nothing.
I first lost my illusions whenever I saw the patent that was held on the seeds. What the patent did was said, you can no longer retain any for your own use. You have to go back to the holder of the patent to get your seed. And I think what flew in the face of many American farmers, especially my father, is, how many people have ever bought anything and it wasn't theirs? I mean, and he would say, it was our soil and our toil, and then what I grew out of my land wasn't mine. And to have to go back to that patent holder it was basically, for what we would call in the U.S., a cash cow. I mean, to allow a patent on a life form virtually gave a monopoly to the patent holder and no competition in the market. And we saw from the beginning when the first for that trait on Roundup Ready, if you will, $6 for that technology per unit, as they called it, going from $6 well up into the mid-20s. It was such a game changer that we shifted all that control over to a few corporations' hands. I believe Monsanto owns about 95% of those patents. I saw how, if you will, Monsanto wanted to enforce their ownership and sent private investigators out and sued the very people they were selling to, farmers who retained their own seeds. They sued a lot of farmers.
In June 2000, Monsanto went even further and sued Canadian farmer Percy Schmeiser, whose conventional canola seeds had been contaminated by Roundup Ready canola. The firm accused Schmeiser of patent infringement for planting these seeds without a license or payment of royalties.
Percy Schmeiser and Schmeiser Enterprises Limited versus Monsanto Canada Inc. et al.
Canadian judges ended up ruling in favor of Monsanto. Percy Schmeiser was declared guilty of patent infringement and quit canola farming.
Let's say you lived in a city and you wanted to paint your house purple. And all your paint, it was very windy, and all your paint blew over on your neighbors' houses. Well, you could sue your neighbors for your paint getting on their houses. That's how the rules were set up for Monsanto.
For me, that was a scandal, a legal scandal. I don't see how the fact that a gene is patented and comes from the crop next door means that I should be robbed of seeds that I take from my own plants. So patenting is something that's extraordinarily dangerous for the diversity of cultivated crops. Because if these companies end up owning practically all human food, there'll be no more diversity in cultivated crops, or very little. Just the few genotypes that are grown by the seed companies. And that is really very dangerous. It would take a single disease to develop on some of these genotypes, and we would have a worldwide agronomic catastrophe. Massive famines on a global scale. I mean, we can discuss whether it's bad for rhinoceroses to exist or not, but the diversity of cultivated crops is simply essential for the survival of the human species.